You know, we at St. Ben, St. John's are fortunate to work with some people who realize that before you talk about diversity, you ought to think about it first. And so I think it's appropriate to take a second to thank some people who brought Professor Wilson with us here today, namely Mary Geller, Vice President, Student Development, Joe Desjardins, Vice Provost, who lent us some support, Shelley Athman, who organized everything, and the members of the Intercultural Directions Council. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the Intercultural Directions Council is a group of faculty and staff who try to promote critical study of race, culture, and difference on our campus, and who try to create spaces for us to have substantial, yet ethical and respectful dialogues about those issues. We here tonight benefit from the industry and commitment of people like these. I first met Professor Kirt Wilson's reputation long before I met the man. I recall my first interaction with him being so distracted that I didn't listen to him at all because I was trying to find his horns. See, among folks who study communication studies, Professor Wilson has a reputation not for intellectual rigor, not that his commitment or enthusiasm is infectious, so much as it is projectile. His expectations are renowned to be so high that they border on the extraterrestrial. And this narrative is actually supported by some of the greatest hits of his own accomplishments, some of which I have a duty to share with you now. After earning his PhD at Northwestern University, Kirt Wilson joined the faculty at the University of Minnesota. During his 14-year tenure at the U, Professor Wilson published in the top journals in communication studies, was awarded a McKnight Presidential Fellowship, the Carl R. Wallace Memorial Award, and his book, The Reconstruction Desegregation Debate, The Politics of Equality and the Rhetoric of Place, earned 2 commendations from the National Communication Association. Most impressive, however, at least for me personally, is that while Professor Wilson was conducting this tremendous, ambitious program of research, he was also a famously dedicated, enthusiastic teacher. So much so that in 2002, I think it was, he won the Arthur Red Motley Award for Best Teacher at the College of Liberal Arts in the University of Minnesota, which is no small accomplishment. Recently, Professor Wilson took his talents to State College, where he now serves as Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences at Pennsylvania State University. Professor Wilson might not know this, but I have it on good authority that after he accepted his position at a faculty meeting, one of his new colleagues, who is himself extremely well published and accomplished, said, and I quote, "Kirt is coming, we better look busy," unquote. Such is Professor Wilson's reputation. But those of us who are fortunate enough to learn with Professor Wilson, with Kirt, like those of us here tonight, are privileged to see more than this reputation. To see that his high expectations, his prodigious talents, serve not his name, but a greater good. Kirt expects so much from himself, and he expects so much from others because he has faith that we can be so much. Those of us who are fortunate enough to learn with Kirt learn that challenge and grace can complement each other, that good intentions without good work are not good enough, and that to expect the best from someone is to expect the best for someone. Kirt's not here tonight to commemorate, nor is he here to celebrate. I think Kirt's here tonight to challenge you to engage the legacy and history of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And so please join me in welcoming my very dear, dear friend, Kirt Wilson.
Wow. A lot of you. I just can't imagine how many grade point average curves are going to be destroyed by all the extra credit that's represented in this hall tonight. Wow. Astonishing. Either that or you're expecting Stephen Colbert to announce his presidency or something. It is, it's a real privilege for me to be with you all tonight to talk about something that's not only important to me, but I think is important to many Americans in this country, right? And that is quite literally, how do we learn to live with one another better than perhaps how we've lived with one another in the past? I want to thank Eric Putnam, Dr. Putnam, there, for a really kind and warm introduction. Dr. Putnam was actually the very first PhD student that I ever had the privilege of working with and graduating out at the University of Minnesota. And I just can't express what joy and pride I have seen in him, but also, quite frankly, in many of his students that I've had the opportunity to meet over the course of the last 16, 17 years. So thank you, Eric. This evening, I want us to think a little bit about what we're engaged in. You see, we're engaged in a kind of celebration that is taking part across the country throughout the course of this week. You see, in my hometown of State College, Pennsylvania, on Monday, there was a small Quaker elementary school, right, that conducted a civil rights sing-along. I know because my 9-year-old son was participating in that sing-along. Members of the State College community gathered to collectively sing the protest songs and the gospel hymns that provided the soundtrack of the civil rights movement. On my home campus, Penn State's Forum on Black Affairs organization hosted a banquet dinner this past Sunday night, and more than 600 individuals attended that dinner. On Monday, students on that campus gathered to watch a documentary film on the Freedom Riders and listen to Barry Scott. You see, Barry Scott is an individual who performs oral interpretations of Dr. King's most famous speeches and his writings. But a little closer to home, here in the state of Minnesota, in Minneapolis, there was a rally for youth that ended in a march to Concordia University. There was an MLK reflection service at the Calvary Church of Minneapolis. And this past Sunday, Ted Mann Concert Hall was the site of an annual concert on the campus of the University of Minnesota. All across this country, in various places, in various locations, in churches, on university campuses, on small college campuses, individuals are gathering to think about, to talk about, to discuss the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, as impressive as perhaps some of these events are, perhaps no event, with the exception of one that I'll mention later on in my speech tonight, can compare to the event that transpired on Tuesday, February 7th of 2006. You see, on that day, the host speaker's name was Bishop Eddie Long. And he approached his podium and he looked out on approximately 10,000 people. And he knew the people fairly well. You see, this auditorium space was his point of ministry. He was the African-American pastor of one of the largest churches in all of Atlanta. But this day, quite frankly, the familiar faces of his black congregation were seated next to international poets, celebrities, senators, congressmen and women, and famous activists from the civil rights movement. Bishop Long couldn't really see former President Bill and then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. He couldn't see George and Barbara Bush or Laura and President George W. Bush because these individuals were actually seated on the podium on the dais behind him. But no doubt, he felt their presence as he called the audience to worship and remembrance, because whether he knew it or not, Bishop Long was at that moment officiating over the most prestigious memorial service the United States had witnessed since the burial of President Ronald Reagan. And before the service had concluded, get this, 33 different speakers, 4 United States presidents, multiple choirs would stand and praise one individual, Coretta Scott King, the wife of Dr. Martin Luther King. There were 8 musical tributes, including performances by Stevie Wonder, B.B. Winans, and Michael Bolton. They move the emotions of the assembled audience. CNN, BET, and TV1 broadcast many hours of this event, while highlights of the service appeared on almost all of the major news channels and most of the nation's nightly news programs. For the recessional, get this, several choirs, the Atlantic Symphony Orchestra, and the J. Berry Orchestra of DeKalb County all joined forces in the Hallelujah Chorus. And from start to finish, this memorial service lasted 6 hours. I'm not going 6 hours tonight. It's okay, right? But seriously, 6 hours. How does one begin to understand such a remarkable event? What, if anything, can such an event teach us about the civil rights movement or about the relative quality of race relations in the United States of America? Now, you see, I am a scholar of rhetoric, right? That is, I analyze the language of speeches, of congressional debates, of political communication to try and understand how symbols and arguments try to persuade audiences. Now, in addition to studying the oratory of many events, rhetoric scholars like myself, what we'll frequently do is we'll track how members of an audience, after a speech, how they interpreted the event that they've just witnessed, right? Now, for the sake of time, I've only got time to kind of talk about 2 reflections on the memorial service that I've just described for you. And the first was from a woman by the name of Rose Offord. Rose was a 32-year-old woman who, when she was speaking to reporters, was weeping. And she said the following, quote, "You know, Coretta Scott King was the queen of Black America. You never saw her in a situation where she wasn't polished and graceful. She was the most distinguished Black woman I've ever seen," end quote. Now, in this statement, one immediately notices the use of a particular metaphor, the idea that Mrs. King was the queen of Black America. The symbolic image of Mrs. King as the queen of Black America kind of helps to explain why President George W. Bush's statement sounded the way that it did on that very day. In honor of Mrs. King, the president said, quote, "By going forward with strong and forgiving heart, Coretta Scott King not only secured her husband's legacy, but she built her own. Having loved a leader, she became a leader. And when she spoke, America listened closely because her voice carried the wisdom and the goodness of a life well lived," end quote. Good line. To celebrate the queen, then, is to celebrate the king and the legacy of that royal family. But in all honesty, that was not the only interpretation of that memorial service that exists. There was an editorial that appeared in the Black newspaper called the New York Amsterdam News that attributes a far more complex set of meanings to this particular event. And this is what this editorial said, and try and listen closely because I think it's really different. Quote, "The show was terrific, and God must have sat somewhere in a very comfortable seat, and he must have been saying to himself, 'Why did I let my people go?' White people were given license for everything they ever did against us by our civil rights leaders, not in the spirit of forgiveness, but in the spirit of the songs that were sung, the heads that were bowed, and the seats of honor for those who attended. A good time was had by all, with every spiritual, with every amen, with every yes, Jesus, with every note from that magnificently robed choir, with the messages being sent saying how wonderful, how good God is." Now, in this interpretation, the style, the emotion, and the performance of the event begin to turn the key to its meaning in a different direction. The speeches, the songs, indeed the memorial's performance produced a kind of multiracial atmosphere of good times, and those good times seems to almost absolve the nation from all its past sin, the sin of racism. More importantly, however, this perspective suggests that perhaps everything is not perfect in the nation. Perhaps there is a hint of irony in the text that makes one question whether the funeral service really signals the triumph or perhaps the demise of the king's dream. The editorial's final words reinforce this hidden tension. Quote, "The homecoming service sent Mrs. Coretta Scott King home in the style that was reminiscent of the March on Washington, with a prayer for our people. May God forgive us all. Now, Mrs. King's memorial service is an illustration of what I'd really like us to think and to talk about this evening. You see, I'm going to begin with the premise that since the mid-1980s, there has been a slow but really significant shift in when, where, and how we talk about race and racism in the United States. I'll begin with a simple, straightforward argument that today we are practically swimming in a collective sea of memory about our past. And much of this memory is actually focused on the 1960s and especially the Civil Rights Movement. A number of scholars with names like Dan Berger, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, Kristen Harold, Joseph Purnell, Christopher Metris, Renee Romano, and Leah Rayford all are scholars who have recently published work that suggests that there is a widespread rise of museums, of ceremonies, of holiday celebrations, of bus tours, of books, of statues that all commemorate the Civil Rights Movement. Dozens of locations throughout the South now have museums dedicated to the protest or that protest. Local mayors, right, and even state tourism boards really begin to welcome visitors to their town or to their region to see the place where perhaps Black Sunday or the Montgomery bus boycott or Project C or the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas took place. Indeed, just months ago, I suspect that many of you here either read about or watched on television as President Barack Obama, Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar, Aretha Franklin, Julian Bond, Dan Rather, Congressman John Lewis, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, and many, many others all gathered in October to what? To dedicate the dream. According to the Washington Post, approximately 10,000 individuals gathered on the National Mall this past October 16th to dedicate the monument to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The Post reported that people of all ages, gray-haired veterans of the segregation movement, as well as those who knew only stories of those times, listened as President Obama announced the following, quote, "This day we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s return to the National Mall. In this place, he will stand for all time." Yet I want to suggest that to simply recognize this rising trend in civil rights memorials and celebrations is, I think, kind of insufficient. I think as academics, we need to ask another kind of question. As students, we need to ask ourselves another kind of question, and that's this. Is all of this celebration of the civil rights movement, and especially Dr. King, is it changing or having an impact on American culture? Is it changing or having an impact on American race relations? Now, the answer, in fact, might be a little bit of yes. In 2009, Larry Griffin and Ken Boland published an essay titled, "What Do These Memories Do?" and it appeared in the American Sociological Review. Using survey data and various contemporary theories of collective memory, these two researchers reported that the civil rights movement is now recalled, right, by Americans with at least modest frequency. In open-ended questions that ask subjects to self-report the most important national or world event that has taken place in the last 50 to 70 years, most respondents said the civil rights movement. In fact, it was often ranked third and always ranked at least 10th. They note further that the relative age of these subjects ended up not mattering at all. It didn't change the results. Young respondents who are far removed from the actual events of the 1950s and 60s still said they remembered the civil rights movement and argued that it was important. Now I have to be clear here, right? When I use the term remembered, I'm using it in a very specific, almost theoretical way, right? When we think about memory, typically what we think about is the idea of cognitive processes. You remember when you stub your toe, right? You remember the pain of that particular event. You remember when your first significant other dumped you, right? You remember that your roommate hasn't washed dishes in what, like 3-4 weeks? Yeah, you remember that. What I'm talking about is a different kind of memory that's first articulated by a theorist by the name of Maurice Halbach, and then extended by Barry Schwartz, Jerry Olick, John Bodnar, a series of others. Now, what they argue, right, is that sometimes memories, in fact, very often, memories are not individual, they're actually collective. They're actually social. In fact, we are socially building a memory right now. And if you look to the person on the left of you and the person on your right of you, they're actually going to shape your memory of this particular event. If they're bored and they're going, right, you're likely to remember my speech a little differently. If they laugh along with my occasional joke, again, you're likely to remember this instant differently. You're even going to remember this particular event differently when tomorrow a friend of yours says, I wasn't at that speech. What was it like? And your relationship with that friend will dictate, at least to some degree, the very nature of the memory that you recall. How provocative was I? Right? How crazy did he get? Right? Was I challenging or was I boring? All of those things are mediated, at least in part, on how we socially construct the memories that we have. And in fact, that is much of how the American public now understands the civil rights movement. We understand it through widespread social phenomena, viewing films like Eyes on the Prize or, of course, The Help. Special episodes of Oprah, right, that discuss an event like the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, or the virtual experience of a modern museum exhibit, or exposure to speeches at events exactly like today. And in fact, the field work of Griffin and Bolin suggests that among individuals who remember in this collective sense the civil rights movement, there has in fact been an important shift in American public opinion. They state, quote, the civil rights movement has become iconic in American political culture for the righteousness of its cause, the purity and efficacy of its tactics, the success of its struggles, and its sweeping applicability to other struggles for voice and justice. But they affirm even further, right, that those individuals who recall the movement positively also have a shift in their beliefs. And their research found the following. Individuals who engage in events like this tend to have the following kinds of beliefs. One, that racism is still a problem in the United States. Two, that racial integration is actually a net positive for neighborhoods and for workplaces. Three, that children benefit from interacting with multiple races. And four, that the government has some kind of role to play in protecting the civil rights of not only African Americans, but of most minority communities in the United States. Put simply, this research would suggest that our culture, right, of civil rights memorialization may in fact beginning to be shifting public opinion towards a more progressive ideas about race. Yet, before we congratulate ourselves too heartily, there's one additional finding that these researchers make that I think it's important to discuss. You see, Griffin and Bolin found evidence that although individuals who participate in positive recollections of the civil rights movement were more progressive on their positions of race and race relations, they also discovered that this correlation between the two things completely fell apart when they were asked not the general question about how you feel about race, but very specific questions about busing. Or very specific questions like, would you be willing to be taxed further in order to support racial programs designed to ameliorate problems in the inner city? They found that many individuals who talked about affirmative action, even though they had positive feelings about race in general, that didn't necessarily trickle down to what we might call the pragmatic policies, right, that are intended to target continued racial disparity. And so they conclude the following, quote, we may see here the limits of racial liberalism and possibly of the civil rights memory frame. A principled commitment to equal rights? Yes. A commitment to rights implementation to redress racial inequity? Not necessarily. It would seem then that the widespread embrace of and participation in the civil rights commemoration has not, in fact, made it easier to agree or to, quite frankly, even debate specific policies designed to target racially disparate power relations and material conditions. You see, in Washington, D.C., at state capitals, and even in city halls and county offices, conversations about public policy and pragmatic programs to redress racial inequality are really few and far between. In fact, such debates typically devolve into personal attacks of character, or allegations of racism, or allegations of reverse discrimination, and the argument that any initiative that targets racial inequalities is, in fact, by its very nature, unconstitutional. It's, in fact, un-American. Now, given this research, I contend that one of the greatest communication problems that we face in 2012 is, in fact, not that we don't talk about race. I think we do. The problem is not that we don't talk about race, it's that we're now entering a period in which there are increasingly strict codes about when and where it is appropriate to talk about race and racism. Now, to explore this idea further, I'd like to, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, I'd like to go to one of the very first theorists of rhetoric, the Greek philosopher known as Aristotle, right? You've encountered him on occasion. I believe he walks the halls of mostly St. John's, but he makes it on the bus on occasion over to St. Ben's as well. Toga, yeah, kind of skinny guy. Damn his height. Now, in his very famous treatise called The Rhetoric, the Greek philosopher Aristotle explained that citizens who wanted to be leaders, who wanted to persuade the public with great oratory, they needed to distinguish between three different genres of speech. And he named these genres. First, he called the first one the forensic genre, which today we understand as legal rhetoric. This involves rules about how to argue over evidence to achieve victory in the courtroom. He said there is a second genre, and he called this genre deliberative oratory. Now, deliberative oratory concerns the business of government. It necessitates an understanding of how to debate and reason over the future impact of policy decisions. The third kind is called epideictic rhetoric. Now, mastery of epideictic oratory could be found at funeral orations and in ceremonies of ritual, in memorials for great people who would give the leader power over the values, emotions, and membership of a community. You see, Aristotle said that epideictic speeches are especially unique because, you see, they use the past in order to establish the present virtues and principles of a particular community. They rehearse a society's important stories, thereby creating social cohesion by including some individuals and excluding others. If you are willing to believe this particular story that the epideictic speaker gives, then you are now participating in the very lessons that, quite frankly, make you a good citizen of the city-state. If you resist the narrative that is offered during an epideictic moment, then quite frankly, you risk expulsion. You are no longer a good member of the city-state if you don't go along with those epideictic narratives and rituals. Finally, it's important to recognize that epideictic or ceremonial events really establish which individuals, living or dead, are the models for citizens to emulate, to imitate, and which are the models that you're supposed to avoid at all costs. Now, note what I'm saying here. When we commemorate and celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when we have days and weeks like what we're engaged in right now, we are engaged in what Aristotle at least would call an epideictic, ceremonial event. Tonight, you and I are engaged in precisely the kind of celebration, right? Relationship building, right? Value reinforcing behavior that makes a group of people into a strong, vibrant community. One of the great things about how many of you are here tonight is not just because you're going to hear what I have to say, but more importantly because you're here collectively to celebrate in this epideictic moment. It literally builds community between and among you. But here's the problem. I honor and affirm the necessity for these kind of epideictic events, but I also want us to recognize that such commemorations do not, in fact, allow us to debate difficult political issues very well, very honestly. with intentionality. You see, our culture of memorialization instead has habituated most Americans to discuss race primarily within the confines of the epideictic genre. As several memory scholars have argued, the civil rights movement is now a part of America's unique story. It is an expression of America's unique values. It is not a black story anymore. It supposedly belongs to us all. I contend that, in fact, our epideictic commemorations of the civil rights movement is perhaps one of the last means by which those of us who want to defend the liberal of the 1960s, that's about the best example we've got, right? In contrast, however, when our elected leaders attempt to talk about things like affirmative action, or how the mortgage crisis has impacted communities of color, about equality and immigration policy, about healthcare reform, about the lessons of the civil rights movement are almost never ever mentioned. That is, the deliberative sphere of policy negotiation and debate has excluded the memory of Dr. King. Now, this is really remarkable when you consider the fact that every one of the themes that I just mentioned were, in fact, important parts of the civil rights movement, right? Think about it this way. The fight for voting rights and desegregation, right? We all know that particular fight, especially if you think about 1964, right? We all know about the fight for desegregation and the fight for voting rights. That has become an important part of what we use to argue for America's core values. The fact that we passed the 64 Civil Rights Act, the fact that we passed the 65 Civil Rights Act, right? It's something that we celebrate on nights like tonight. But the opinions of Dr. King and the civil rights movement never seem to be particularly relevant when we want to discuss the use of voter IDs to screen who gets to vote in one state or another. So what are the implications for our democracy if the goals and programs of the Black freedom struggle are discussed only in moments of epideictic celebration? Well, I think there are two potential consequences that I want to mention briefly, right? I want you to recall, if you don't mind, something that transpired in 2010, okay? Is it going to come up? Sure it is. Some of you remember that Glenn Beck held a little rally in Washington, D.C., right? As the Washington Post remarked, quote, on the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, steps away from where it was delivered, Beck and fellow Tea Party icon Sarah Palin staked a claim to King's legacy and to that of the Founding Fathers. End quote. Now, I want to be really clear about this next point. When I hear about events like the one that was organized by Beck and Palin, I start to get a little bit nervous, right? But I want to be clear about why I'm nervous. I am not nervous because I believe that conservatives have no right to claim Dr. King as their own. I, in fact, think that's wrong. The civil rights movement is as much the property of conservatives, perhaps, as it is of liberals. Remember that Dr. King himself was critiqued by many members of the civil rights movement, in particular SNCC and the Black Power movement, for being too conservative, right? The problem, however, is that often when Dr. King is used in moments like this, Dr. King becomes invisible rather than more visible. Perhaps some of you have read Ralph Ellison's excellent book called The Invisible Man, right? If you haven't read The Invisible Man, I hope that you'll do that, right? I recommend it. It's an excellent, excellent book. In the first paragraph of that book, Ralph Ellison, reflecting upon experiences of African Americans, talks about what it's like, from his perspective, to be an African American man. And he says the following, quote, I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe. I am not one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance. I am a man of flesh, bone, fiber, and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. It is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. And so when people look at me, when they approach me, they don't see me, they see only my surroundings. or they see themselves, or they see figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. Now, when Ralph Ellison penned these words, he was talking about what it meant to be a black man predominantly in the 1940s and the 1950s. In his day and in ours, being invisible is not about a lack of substance. It's not about having superpowers, right, that allows you to just kind of disappear or appear at will. Instead, being invisible is about being seen or not seen by a society in all of your complexity, in all of your humanness, in all of your true being. Being invisible is about standing in the middle of a group of people who believe that they know who you are, that they know what you want, that they know what is good for you, that they know what you are capable of, even when in fact they've never even asked you your name. Now, at one level, I guess, being invisible is a little bit like being in junior high school, right? Sometimes, right, invisibility is sometimes about being an icon. It's about being a hero in one moment and then quickly forgotten in another. But what Ralph Ellison wants his readers to understand is that racism's impact on the African American community had turned African Americans invisible, and the experience of invisibility had very specific consequences for communities of color. And those consequences go well beyond what it's like to feel lonely and isolated as a 13-year-old boy or girl. Indeed, invisibility, I would argue, is the first real danger that lurks behind our country's desire to memorialize and to celebrate the civil rights movement. After looking through, in my own research, most of the national oratory that celebrates the civil rights movement in the last 20 years, I believe that we are in danger of making Dr. King and the movement invisible as both stand there in plain sight. Because what we say about the movement has led us to believe that we already know all about it. We know all of its potentialities. We know all of its possibilities. More important, I would argue, we have started to use Dr. King as a kind of empty sign, a signifier for what we want to see about America. We're beginning to use Dr. King much in the same way as those hard lenses of glass that Ralph Ellison talked about. We see a certain kind of race, but not another kind of race. We see a certain kind of relationship to the American dream, but not another kind of relationship to the American dream. We, quite frankly, see more of ourselves than we see of him. Thomas Jackson's 2007 book is called From Civil Rights to Human Rights, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Struggle for Economic Justice, argues for a very different way of understanding Dr. King. Jackson contends that from his earliest days as a seminary student, King was actually very critical of unfettered, unregulated capitalism. As early as 1957, King believed that federal policies such as the guaranteed employment, family assistance, and economic redistribution were in fact critical to the fight against racism. In speech after speech, King argued that prejudice and poverty were intertwined. In fact, we forget that almost all of King's campaigns against segregations were also campaigns in favor of more jobs, in favor of full employment. Jackson even makes a very controversial claim, one that some historians disagree with, that while Dr. King was a vocal critic of anti-American forms of communism, the kinds that existed in places like the Soviet Union or China, King was also and simultaneously a Christian socialist. King's interpretation of the Bible and his philosophy of government led to conclusion, at least according to Jackson's research, that society and government were responsible for the lives of its poorest and neediest citizens. And I'm going to argue that it's not surprising that this version of Dr. King almost never finds its way into the national commemorations of the civil rights movement. Now, in addition to the process by which the civil rights movement becomes invisible, remember that's the first consequence I mentioned? I want to suggest that there's a second concern that corresponds to the impact of civil rights memorialization in American culture. I want to suggest to you today that we find ourselves in a really strange place. where we simultaneously celebrate the election of America's first black president, while we also simultaneously become extremely anxious if this president seems to talk about anything that is racial in any context that isn't a ceremony honoring Dr. King or the civil rights movement. Remember that throughout the 2008 campaign, and especially in the moment of the president's election, the media framed Obama's person and his popularity as the triumph of the civil rights movement, right? One of the most frequent past-present associations that was made with President Obama and that was used by the media was to juxtapose Dr. King with then Senator and then President Obama, as you see in this picture from the San Francisco Chronicle and others. In fact, using either the trope of King's dream, which was fulfilled by the black candidate president, or the comparative analyses of two men's oratory, reporters affirmed that the two men were linked across decades of racial struggle. Now, the fact that Obama's status, right? The fact that Obama's status occupies the socially constructed status of an African-American man is actually essential to his position within the media as the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream, right? It wouldn't work for him to be the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream if he was white. Wouldn't even work, really, for him to be the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream if he was Asian American. His blackness, folks, matters. Yet, if the president, in his role as president, in a deliberative context, begins to simultaneously invoke his blackness, he is swiftly criticized because he is said to be taking sides in any public concern over a contemporary civil rights issue. Many of us remember that in 2009, Obama was widely criticized for saying that the Cambridge Police Department, remember this incident, had acted stupidly for arresting noted black academic Henry Louis Gates Jr. outside of his own home. At the time, Obama remarked, quote, "Separate and apart from this incident, there is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately." And then he said the words, "This is just a fact." But if you read the media accounts, right, around this particular incident that led to the infamous beer summit, right? Indeed, many Americans did not agree with the president. Furthermore, they were appalled that the president, despite the fact that he was himself African American, would even broach the issue of racial profiling in this manner. Now, in this instance, a pragmatic issue in which the exercise of police power is, at least within the African American community, a significant population within this country, interpreted as, right, a reflection of past racial practices, Obama was actually encouraged to dismiss his race and not let it influence his comments. Now, I do want to be clear about something, right? I want to be clear that there may, in fact, have been several good reasons, at least political reasons, why a sitting president should avoid really any commentary about the actions of a specific police officer or local law enforcement. That said, it's very difficult to ignore the fact that the criticism that Obama received at the time and the media coverage of the event itself put his race, and especially and importantly, Obama's willingness to talk about race in this setting as a severe problem, rather than an opportunity to have a national discussion about the impact of police enforcement within the African American community. In fact, the Democratic strategist and ABC News consultant, Donna Brazile, put it this way in what I thought was a very interesting and startlingly open statement. Quote, "No one wants to talk about race. There are designated times," she said, like Martin Luther King Jr. Day, or when we have a large gathering of black folks, like at an NAACP rally, but that's about it. Then she went on to say, quote, "In this case, Obama was asked a question directly, and he just answered it honestly." Now, she didn't use the words, "and that was a mistake," but that's precisely the next statement that one might assume should appear, given how she talked about it. And so there, in fact, is the problem. The very president that many celebrated as the indicator of America's progress in the era of race relations spoke honestly about a subject of his own race, of African Americans, and he discussed quite frequently, right? And yet he was widely criticized for even broaching the subject. He was criticized for being racially partisan when he talked about a pragmatic political issue that, quite frankly, was widely discussed within the civil rights movement that today we are celebrating so openly. So, where do we go? Where do we go from here? Perhaps we need to listen once again to the words of Coretta Scott King. In a speech that Coretta Scott King gave to the United Farmers Workers Union in 1970, Mrs. King said the following, quote, "Social progress has always come when the people on the bottom, who in organized strength and from the foundation shook the whole structure. Social change does not come from voluntary goodwill. It does not come from charity from the top. Social change comes from motion at the bottom." Now, to be clear, we can and we should hold our elected leaders accountable. We can and we should expect more of our political dialogues, whether they're in Congress or whether they're from the current or some future presidential administration. But what we must also realize is that perhaps it is up to us to act. It is up to us to determine how and when we use the past to push the arc of history in the present. We cannot look to President Obama or to any other elected official to change the structure of our rhetorical culture because they are perhaps the most constrained by its rules and by its regulations. You see, the strange irony of epideictic moments is that they can sometimes trap the speaker who herself fears that they will say something wrong and risk ruining what would be a moment of celebration. Presidents fear that a single odd phrase will be repeated or misunderstood or purposefully misrepresented by their opponents and by the news media that loves ratings far more than it loves the truth. We need to start using our King Day celebrations to not only build communities like what we're building here tonight, to not only share the stories that make us proud to be American citizens. We must act in a manner that makes the civil rights movement in all of its complexity more relevant to our political deliberations about what we will do next. In 1970, Mrs. King said, "If this nation can produce $1 trillion every year, it is a disgrace in the eyes of God that some people should be haunted by hunger and hounded by racism. The President of the United States should not gloat and take pride in $1 trillion economy. He should be ashamed and mortified to acknowledge that abundance exists while the very system that produces this abundance still tends to cheat the poor. His days should be restless until the crime and the violence of poverty is rooted out of the land that is rich beyond imagining." Folks, these are the words that we still need to hear. These are the words that American citizens need to start saying whenever we talk about the pressing concerns of our political future. When we find the courage, and perhaps when we create the opportunities to start saying words like these, not just in ceremonial moments like tonight, but when we're making the hard and fast decisions over where this government's money will go tomorrow, then we will have the right to say that the civil rights movement has made a real difference in our lives and in our culture. Thank you.